Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Genesis 24, where Isaac gets a bride, in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. Genesis 24, beginning in verse 2, Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he owned. Now, earlier in the book of Genesis, we're given a specific name to that servant, but that might not be the servant anymore because Abraham's gone on a number of years, and maybe that servant has retired or passed away, or so he's not given by name. But he calls in his servant and he says, "Please place your hand under my thigh," and that's an interesting place to be putting your hand. And he says, "I will make you swear by the Lord." What he's doing, he's swearing by the covenant sign of circumcision, and instead of saying that, it's a little bit more polite to say, "Your hand is under my thigh," but that's where it's headed. "And I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I live, but you will go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac." So as the story develops, it's time for Isaac to have a wife. And Abraham is sending his servant, his most trusted, the oldest of his household, who is his steward, and that servant is going to travel. Let's look at our map. We're going to travel from Canaan back to Haran, that place, that stopover place where, remember, Abraham at the beginning of the Abraham narrative had left Ur of the Chaldees and had come up to Haran, and there most of the family had stayed behind. And from there, Abraham and Sarah and Lot had traveled on to Canaan. So the servant is traveling back to Haran to get from there a wife for Isaac. And of course, the question is, how do you know she'll come? And the servant actually voices that question, and Abraham says, "Well, listen, if the bride won't come, then you're off the hook. But you don't take my son up there. My son's supposed to stay here in the land. You're going to get a bride for her, and I believe the Lord's going to bring this about." And so Abraham is sending his servant in faith to get a bride for Isaac. Now, as we follow, the camera angle of the story, as it were, follows the servant in this caravan up to Haran, and as he gets to Haran, he's saying, "Gee, how am I going to even find a bride?" And I'm looking, for somebody from that family relationship, and he says, "Lord, will you just send the person, the girl, who will not only, as we get to the well, is not only going to draw water for me, but will also volunteer to water the camels." And all of a sudden, Rebecca shows up, and sure enough, she has a water drawing device, and she gives him water. And when she had finished giving him a drink, she says, "I will draw also for your camels until they have finished drinking." And it's a wonderful insight into here the servant's praying, and his prayer is answered exactly. And he says, "Wow, what a girl. Who are you?" And it's at this point, now we, the reader, have already been told ahead of time who this is, and we sort of would have guessed it anyway. But now the servant finds out that the girl who has met him by the well is none other than Rebecca, I guess this is a sort of a first cousin of Isaac, but that's going to be the promised bride. And so the servant will negotiate with Laban, her brother, and the extended family. And of course, Rebecca's asked her, is she willing to leave her home and her family to go and be the bride of cousin Isaac? And of course, marrying first cousins to us, it seems like just sort of weird, but it was accepted back then, a very different world in which they lived. Now, by the time we get to the law, that's going to be put on the side. That's not going to be anymore. But at this point, it was considered appropriate and normal. And so Rebecca agrees to come and be the bride of Isaac. Now, what I want you to notice is a motif that begins right here. It is the motif of an encounter at a well. And this is really a romance motif, because we've just seen, it's not Isaac who meets her right at this point, but it's the servant who comes and says, I'm looking for that bride for my master's son. I'm looking for a bride for Isaac, and meets her at the well, and she waters the camels, and she's the girl, even though the bride and the groom don't meet until they get back into the promised land. And so Rebekah hears of the one who shall be her husband, and it all starts off with an encounter at a well. We're going to go forward when we come to the Jacob story. We'll see that Jacob meets Rachel at the same well. Where he has to leave home, and he comes to the well of Haran, and there's Rachel. And it's love at first sight, and they marry, and it's happy ever after, well, sort of. The next time we see an encounter at a well, it's in the book of Exodus, where Moses has left Egypt. He's sort of on the run, and he comes to a well in Midian, and he meets Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, and they meet, and they get married, and they live happily ever after. Well, sort of. I'm not really sure what happens to the rest of their life. The next time we see an encounter by a well, the well's not actually mentioned. We sort of read between the lines, but it's in the story of Ruth, where Ruth meets Boaz, and our hint that there's a well there is that there's water jars mentioned in Ruth chapter 2, verse 9. And if you've got water jars, you've got to have a place where you get the water from, and so there's a hint there that there's a well there. And by now, it's an established motif. It's sort of like when you see one of those old westerns when I was a kid, and the hero walks in with a white hat, and you know that he's going to beat the bad guy, and he's going to get the girl, and they'll ride off into the sunset, and they're going to live happily ever after. And it's that kind of motif. And the next time we read about one is in the New Testament, where Jesus comes to a well, and there he meets a Samaritan woman. And it's not a romance in the romantic sense, it's a spiritual romance, where she comes and she meets Jesus and she falls in love, not in a physical way, but spiritually she recognizes that he is her Lord and Savior. And we are invited to that kind of romance. Have you come to the well? Have you met the Savior? Have you fallen in love with him? Have you been joined to him?